Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome to day 6, hour 2 of this Nebulous live development creation series. I messed up my microphone again on the last video. I did not realize it was using the wrong default microphone, so it wound up being activated but not using the correct mic, and I didn't notice till I took a look at the video. So this time I've managed to fix my microphone. Alright, so I'm going to simply jump into the work I was up to last time. At this point I have a UI that almost supports research and infrastructure. However, I was running through some syntax changes for these values. And let me double check if they cleared or not. They didn't clear, so let me see where it's not convinced. Alright, so here I ran an if else. So I can't do an else else. Is effectively what it's suggesting here. This has to do with the active scanning frequency. They all have if else's. Alright, so the idea would be if there is a raycast hit, there is an active selection. However, there are no instances where there is a component match. Effectively, this is supposed to happen. So we would almost need to run an if on this just to see. Effectively, it's just a hard. It might not be necessary because effectively what this is doing is setting the values to 0, but I have the settings getting set to 0 in these events. So I'm wondering if I need the else block at the end. If I've basically split that up to anytime the object is, anytime the selection does not have a active component, it automatically gets deactivated. And eventually that is going to happen for something that is outside of the raycast hit. Or something that just returns no effect. So I think I'm pretty sure what I need to do is remove this. And the cases for having no component will handle themselves. And down here we may need to add a couple more of these for null selection. Alright, so let me see if the values update correctly on selection. Okay, so the economy value still is correct, but the other two are not correct. And that is possibly because I don't have those components on the object. So I'm going to need to drop maximized mode and take a look in play mode at the prefab instantiation and whether or not it has the components I want them to have. And it has the economy infrastructure, but it doesn't have the other two. So I will need to go to spawn celestial bodies, and we're going to have to add these components. So we had scanning range infrastructure. And I suppose we can just go like this still. We are simply adding a scanning range infrastructure value. This actually has a capital it will also be a starting value. So we would have capital starting scanning radius. We might as well add capital starting scanning frequency. And in this instance, the value can now equal capital starting scanning range. In this instance, I said radius. We also need to add the scanning radius infrastructure, or excuse me, scanning frequency. And this will initialize them with the proper components and values set from the game object side from here. So I can set up a starting scan range to be 5, a starting scan frequency to be 3. And from here the values should set upon selecting the capital planet. And they do set. However, the scanner is not setting there properly. Alright, so this is suggesting we change the name of this to active selection economy element. Or no, I changed these to a value, didn't I? Let me double check those. And that's upon it's basically this Okay, it is called active selection economy value, so we might be able to save that error just by changing this name. So let me take another look here. But essentially, I'm also going to require the scan delegation code to update the scanner properly. This is all correct. If I leave it, it's not correct. If I select the sun, it is correct. So I need to update a couple more elements in that regard, but I can effectively swap between selections that have different infrastructure capacities, which makes a big difference in planets for sure. So if you scan around, get a couple planets, you can select between them and essentially invest in their economy and scanning or whatever you want to do, basically. And there are other things that you can scan that won't have the ability to have those things, more or less. Or they aren't worth it to have in multiple places or something like that. It's kind of more of a balance thing, but helps for understanding the value in a selection and gives the player the ability to invest in certain parts of the game world that gets changed based on the amount they invest. And it will have a difference on the space around them to whatever degree they can afford. So these first three aren't so bad, but I've got to fix this bug where it's not deselecting all of them on the else block, and I need to fix the scanner. So the else block thing was basically in here, and it was more or less this down here though, and with different naming convention, which I might as well pretty sure these are the same. Might be a great time for academics to mention functions. However, doing it like this does not tie it into any function, which is something I've been experimenting with in development a little bit more, as a way to make smaller but more consistent progress. Not need to plug everything into a certain system, or a certain group of systems or something. So if I select this, now we select all three, and if I deselect it, they all get turned off properly, and they're not clickable. Whereas if I grab it, they can be clicked. Okay, so now I need to fix this. The scanner is not activating on active selection. So I only grabbed those three elements. But I have not what I have not done is go into the active scanning UI and activate it, which I thought I had already done. Here it is getting reset to default. I must have accidentally deleted this. because I'm basically grabbing something like this, and I'm just simply doing it in here. However, there is a condition where I guess it's already at a default value. So I need to grab these elements and set the radius, set the angle, set the frequency. However, I need to set them to these component values. And here actually I have that. Alright, so messing up my control flow a little bit, looks like. I've got the ability to change them here. But it's missing a step where I do believe the main element must be stuck off, essentially. So I select this, active scanning elements. Its default display value is on, but its opacity is down. It's not, active scanning elements is not set to false at any point I'm aware of. Oh, it is at the very end. So I have to set active scanning elements to true whenever the scanner has, I guess this comes down to a design decision. The scan, if the player can invest in frequency and range, effectively if they start with just range, do they need a frequency? Or will I give them the default frequency of 1 with any range, whether they've invested in frequency or not? I think that's something that's probably better. That way it's not consequential to not have frequency and to have range. So it kind of unties them a little bit. So therefore, either if it has, basically needs scanning range. If it has scanning range and no frequency, or if it has no scanning range but frequency, it doesn't matter because it doesn't have any range. It could be the same thing, though. The default value for range could be like 5, and the player could feasibly go with frequency first. It's kind of a design balance thing, and I'm not sure at this exact moment which one I should do. So for now, I do believe I'm going to assume the scanning range or scanning frequency needs to be true. If that's the case, then the active scanner needs to activate. Which can look something like this. But I'm not resetting it to these default values. I'm in fact they're already getting set properly. They're already getting set properly like this anyways. So I don't actually need to set this. The only thing that really needs to happen is the active scanning elements needs to get set to true. And its opacity needs to just get set to 1, I suppose. And this is if this or this have a value. So if scanning range infrastructure or scanning frequency infrastructure, then activate the scanner, because some and I do believe this will allow the scanner to turn on, because down here, if there's no selection, same code here is run and simply turns off the scanner. So let's see how far this has gotten me. Plug in here and interplay mode. I don't think I had any default values to set. I select this, it brings the scanner on, that's good. However, the maximum values did not update properly. Let's see, what if I change the values? Okay, so it is actually set up with the proper scan range, and it can go up to the proper scan frequency. So it is actually setting up with the planet's values properly. And it looks like it's using the economy value. So it's like somewhere I'm messing up these two, which were the active scanning radius max and active scanning frequency max for player, which is more just for player feedback than anything else. Just have this in here. So the hide value is set to this, but I have to set the active scanning frequency max value. And active scanning frequency max, active scanning frequency. So I'm envisioning going to have to grab the label for the active scanning frequency max, which is going to be a query from the root for a label that is, I think it was just active scanning frequency max. And in this instance, we have to set this label here also. It's a active scanning frequency max dot text equals, and I'm actually going to just need to bring it down here, say it equals this to a string value. Although it is going to have a let's see, we'll have to see how this works. There is a potential pitfall here where the floats will start to get way too many decimal points, and it'll look tacky in the UI, so we're going to have to see how this looks. But for now, what we've got is the frequency number should update properly. And if this works, then we can do the range number. And from there, it just comes down to investing in the infrastructure and also increasing those numbers and making it to where the player has increased range from their infrastructure investment. In this instance, it didn't go to 3 properly, which is the maximum. And I can set it up to where it only goes up by 1 anyway. But when you start getting the tech involved, there's small percentage increases. So this 3 could actually max out to like 3.2. So somebody might have to learn how to just do 2 decimal points. But we'll see what happens. For now, we'll leave it like this. So besides for that bug, we do something like this. It looks like it spent more than I thought. Or no, that's how much it would cost to do another one. Okay, so since this worked, we just have to do it on the other one as well. It's pretty straightforward. So I have to grab a label. Active scanning range max equals root, and we're querying for a label that is the active scanning and I had to double check exactly what I called it. Active scanning radius max. I have to take that value and set its text to be scanning range infrastructure dot value dot toString to the same degree, and it will, upon selection, update that value. In the event the value updates, it will also have to come back here and grab these elements and update the high value. So I guess we can take a quick look at that. The next part is going to be investing in the infrastructure properly. So I select this. Okay, it says 5 and 3. And I don't have any deficit economy just yet. I suppose I can leave the scanning cost in here. And it's already working where you can't scan if you can't afford. Can't afford it. There's just that little bug. And I need to figure out the investment system. So for the investment system, let me see, I'm going to close everything but player data. And essentially I need this to start working. So I've got a current investing list, and anytime this button is clicked, or any of its fellow infrastructure buttons is clicked, essentially this interface will let us put our component, our economy value, or it'll let us put our economy infrastructure component in that list, and some other algorithm can simply add one to whichever value is next in like a list that is kind of like a queue. And it gives us a little bit of fine-tuned control over how the text system can get scaled, and it allows us to track the deficit, the economy deficit of investment. So that way if the player starts to stack investments, it's easy to tell that they are running out of juice. So yeah, to check these buttons, I called them invest in active selection economy button. Okay. I didn't change their names yet, so invest in active selection economy. And then this one has to get changed to invest in active selection might as well call it invest in active selection scanning range button. Same thing on here is going to be invest in active selection scanning frequency button. I guess while we're here we might as well fix this one also. This one's going to have to get renamed. So it's not clear active selection economy, it's clear active selection scanning frequency investment. Same thing up here. Active selection scanning range investment. And I believe this one's already correct. Clear active selection economy investment button. And one more thing I can check is, are these named correctly? So active selection scanning frequency value, active selection scanning range value, and active selection economy value. Okay. So that I have these all named correctly, I have to what should I do? Go into the, I suppose I could go into the, it's not active scanning elements anymore. I don't think active selection readout has too much going on. It's more the maybe it's this one. So the infrastructure investment elements. Okay, so basically this, but for all of them. So now we have economy clear. So if I clear the economy, then I do in fact need to grab the current investing list, so I need to remove And effectively what I need to remove is player data dot current active selection dot get component. Oh, wait a minute. Get component. And we have to call this component. This is just what our economy infrastructure component. And this will effectively remove this component from the list, which means it will no longer cycle through the economy as a deficit. So to the same degree, if the economy is invested in, then we have to take the list and simply add the same concept, player data's current active selection, if I can type it correctly, of course. And we are grabbing its economy infrastructure component. So that's pretty generic. There's probably room to write a function here because I can pass in a generic type for the component and maybe write the name differently, but this is actually all that has to happen for the subscription. And what effectively happens is the UI feedback is completed for the internal system to actually crunch the values. Therefore, if we just take this and duplicate it a few times, it will be also complete. So we'll run this. It's not economy clear, it's going to be scanning range clear, scanning range invest, if I can type it. Then we've got player data is correct. This component needs to be scanning range infrastructure. Or is it scanning radius? Oh, wait, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And then make sure we name this correctly. So we've got clear active selection economy investment button, which in fact we simply just probably wanted to switch these two to scanning range investment button. And now we just run this again down here. So we wind up changing this to say scanning frequency clear, and then change this to scanning frequency invest. And then we will also make sure this is changed to scanning frequency. I might be able to do it down here also, but this needs to get changed once more to scanning frequency. Whoops, take that out of there. And it works as an interface, so they all just get removed. And the interface changes their value through a different set of code, which we are actually pretty close to writing. If these three are correct. So let's assume they're correct for a second, and let's jump back over here. I think I'm going to have to make a new component. I could also possibly write it in here as part of the update loop. something has to run, essentially iterate. I almost probably could do it in the iterate player economy component. And through here what can happen is every tick it has to take some number from the list and increase their values by 1 and then add them back into the back of the list, basically. And more or less, this will give the player the ability to it'll give them the ability to shape how their economy works. Without having to kind of like micromanage the growth. Is part of where I'm trying to go with this. So total economy gain per tick is effectively changed by or in fact this could get changed upon the investment being subscribed, but more specifically it would effectively change per the parallel capacity of the research branch, basically. And that parallelism will yield a number that lowers the economy input deficit. So the total economy gain per tick is effectively the deficit. And each tick it has to actually take whatever that number is and change the economy by that number. There's even more specifics where the economy could run on debt, and it would be an interesting way to like sync the economy. It would force a lot of economy infrastructure at a diminished rate, but then if you could float out of the debt, it would like result in the higher prosperity. So I've considered doing that, but I'm not sure how far the debt would be able to go. It's another thing you could research. So I'm really trying to consider how I should plug this list in here. It's essentially every value in the list, or no, it's essentially the first X number of values in the list, and that number is increased as the player invests into parallel research as a research input. And that effectively increases the amount of parallel units they can have that can hit per tick. That allows you to prioritize groups of stuff, or the same thing can get run multiple times. And this would also be curtailed with a, very likely curtailed with a value that increases the efficiency of a singular run as a way to balance against, or as a way to complement the frequency, the parallelism. So there'd be instances where the parallelism would be a better investment, and there's instances where you would want to invest in raw capacity, would be more efficient as well. That's going to take a little bit more thinking about what to name those, though, but the idea is still on the table to have that dual research capacity, or like a dual investment capacity thing going on. So I still have to consider how to do that part. For now, though, more or less, the player data has a total economy gain per tick, which is effectively, as I've been saying, our deficit display. So I even called the economy deficit. So if I just query for economy deficit in here, I can update the deficit's readout with whatever the tick's going to be anyway. So for that I'm going to have to, and I do have a root visual element, so I can say root. And because this is happening in the update loop, it usually doesn't hurt to just cache this. So I'm just going to call this label economy deficit. And then here we will query for economy deficit. Let me double check if I called it deficit or deficit value. Okay, I just called it economy deficit. So economy deficit, and then the economy deficit needs to get set. Text needs to equal player data dot total economy gain per tick to a string. I'll keep it simple. See if it breaks it. And the thing I wanted to do here was change the text color if it was greater than 0, or lower the text color to red if it was less than 0. So I'm going to say if player data total economy gain per tick is greater than or equal to 0, then this actually has to say this number, but there is actually a string with a plus sign and a space, and that string is added to this string to affect a positive, so it'll say plus the value. And we also then need to say that the style, the color, or is it color or is there text color? I think color is used to draw the text. Okay, so economy distance style to color equals green. So color.green, it might be a little too dark of a green, but we'll see. And here I can play it safe and just say else if player data dot total economy gain per tick is just less than 0. Then more or less we're doing this, but this part is a minus sign, and the color is going to be red. And we have red negative look to it. And with this is checking. This is doing something a little different. And now this is happening every tick. It can happen even less with a smarter system that detects rate of change or something like that, but for now it's only happening every tick, which is like, so it's effectively once every 60 frames, basically, depending on some hardware specifics. And it gives a deficit it essentially gives a live deficit of what direction the economy is headed. So let me see if this is going to work properly, because it's set up to work like this, but on deselection it's not, or I guess it's in the iterator, isn't it? So other things are going to have to change what this value says. So the planet on start might have an effect on, let's see. And it says +5 and it's increasing by +5, so that's proper. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So now if we select the planet, the idea would be if I start investing in this, it would lower that +5 to +4, but I don't think it's set up all the way yet. Yeah, let me see if my player data, it's a list, so it's not even showing up anyway. Okay, but this was technically correct. So the idea would be if I wanted to increase my scan range, if I click invest, it should lower this number to like 4, but then my scan range starts to go up and I'll be able to scan much further. It's kind of the goal. So for that I'm going to need to once again change this tick value based on new additions or revocations to what's getting invested in, which can span from infrastructure to research to scanning to ship creation, potentially even into the diplomacy system at some point. So it's going to have to, I mean, at this point the easiest thing would be to change that value anytime the list runs. More or less, that can happen here, where the player data grabs the list, and I have to basically say for like 4 elements basically. The first element through the third element have to get removed from the list. So we actually say this. We are removing this player data. Oh, but that's going to shift the elements of the array of the list. Okay, so now I'm getting back into the idea of it being a queue, basically. So let me just try that. So I use a queue instead. can more or less do this part as I was trying to do it. But I can grab the Q and I have to, let me see if I can, I think this takes off the first element, which I'm trying to do. And I'm grabbing an ifloat iterate. We do in fact want to add this back in to the queue, so we would enqueue it. And we would want to on this instance, it would receive its investment, but it would also oh no, I guess I wouldn't want this, would I? Okay, so essentially each time these get added, well, that wouldn't work either. The deficit would have to just be tied into how many of these there are. And that could just change on the tech. Effectively, it's going like this. And this 4 needs to be different. It needs to be a certain value for let's see, public float. We'll call this this one could functionally be an integer. And we'll call it investment parallel value. And more or less this is that. So even if the value is 1, this will properly iterate the value. The idea is that if that value is up to like 16 or something, it'll iterate the value. And this tick value would be, this tick value we would rather change. I would rather change that value anytime we change an investment. Seems a bit like a better idea. So if this works correctly, all of these components should gain their investments. The other cute thing is that if the, I don't know if this will actually work, but if the player data has a value of like 4, there's only one thing in queue. The idea is that it could actually invest in itself 4 times. So I guess that's true. If the investment takes place, then that does mean that the player data's economy does have to go down 1. Which is effectively why having an accurate deficit makes some sense. So I'm just considering this, if it's accurate or not. I think it is correct though. However, it also changes it down here. Which means I wouldn't want to account for it here because total economy gain per tick is changing somewhere else. Alright, so let's see. So I suppose the only other thing to test would be whenever we attach the economy invest. Okay, so here if we click it, it will add it to the list. Oh, and actually, one thing else we should do is if it is being invested within, we can in fact turn off the button. And in the event we clear the element from the list, we can turn the button back on. This is going to guard the button from adding the same element to the list multiple times. And it'll be more clear when the element is in effect or not, in conjunction with the numerical value. So let's see if this works or not. I think I need to set one data value. You know what? Kind of lost track of myself there at the end. So video's at over an hour now, an hour and 2 minutes, hour 3 minutes. So I'm going to cut it for now, and then when I come back though, I'm going to keep working on setting up this investment system to where selections get invested within, and that affects the economy's deficit. And values, relevant values in the game that rely on that infrastructure. So thank you for watching up to this point if you have, and take care. I'll see you in the next one.